Please welcome to the stage CEO and President of EMA, Debbie Levin.
So I'm going to be really honest right now. I feel like the time that I had to follow Stevie Nicks to make a speech at a wedding. This is a superstar, and I'm so proud of everything this morning. And I think that the real takeaway here is listening from the whole morning. And I think that that is something that we need to do as a species. I feel like we don't listen. And the next conversation we're gonna have is kind of about that, about listening and really being open to other people's thoughts and other people's feelings, and not having a block when it comes to being open. And so with that, we're so happy to have connected with a remarkable climate activist in the world of education, Dr. Colin Polsky. He has been trained as a geographer, specializing in human dimensions of global environmental change. Colin has laser focused on a state that is definitely in the epicenter of climate uncertainty. Joining the Florida Atlantic University faculty as professor of geosciences in August 2014, his primary responsibility is to direct the Florida Center for Environmental Studies. And that's just his day job. Please welcome Dr. Colin Polsky. Our music here. So my biggest question right away is, how did you bring your professional career to Florida?
Well, I was doing grad school at Penn State and then a postdoc at Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government, and then 11 years on the faculty in Massachusetts at Clark University. And I was assuming increasingly more responsibility on leadership and program building. So I always wanted to be an academic, research and teaching, and so I'm still doing that and have, and probably always will. But the leadership that I had the bug, and then I saw this opportunity in Florida, which was a place that is like, you know, a test case for climate change impacts and responses, or lack thereof, for around the world, because the impacts there are there today. And this was about 10 years ago. And so I saw an opportunity at a university where I could still be a kind of dorky professor, but also, you know, be involved in a program with responsibilities to work with the public, in a place where, again, it's happening. Climate change is there. And again, it's Florida as a test case, because other places will have the similar experiences in coming decades.
Exactly, and we've all heard so much about that. You just testified at the Florida State Senate. Please explain what you were doing and tell us about that.
I went up to Tallahassee to congratulate a bunch of Republicans for a job well done on climate change policy.
So really talk about that.
I just wanted to let that sink in a little bit. So I'm here, as I was saying earlier this morning, to talk about some of what I'll be here talking with Debbie, and thanks for inviting me, by the way. This is fantastic.
So happy to have you.
Is to talk about a bit about politics without being political. And so I think all of us are familiar with the national narrative around climate change as it's passed through the political spectrum or prism, and that is it's been very polarized. And you've got on the one hand one party that's been supporting the idea of the science as well as just the general principle or premise that we need to do something, and the other party that's tried everything very effectively to do the opposite. So that's the national narrative, and so even Tuesday night we had a conversation at dinner around this question of, do you still believe in climate change, or do you believe in climate change, and what do you do when you come across somebody? So I'm just here to say that that partisan division in Florida is over.
Really need to explain that.
Well, it's what I was sensing from Massachusetts when I saw the opportunity, and I wanted to go and and really feel it out. And basically, it's not complicated or rocket science. The kind of number one climate change impact that's there is flooding from sea level rise. And, you know, water is H2O. It's not GOP or DEM. It's just, and so people, it just becomes a silly debate when their socks get wet. It's just, and so that's been going on now for the better part of a decade. And of course, there are other concerns in an already pretty hot place about rising temperatures, and in a place that already has hurricanes, possibly having intensified hurricanes. So people are just, they don't have time for the, you know, silly national debate.
So do they, in Florida, when you meet somebody, you're going out to dinner with someone, you're somebody at your kid's school, do they understand that climate change is a reality, and do they understand the reasoning behind it, or are they just like, we now live in a climate change situation and we don't really care why it's there?
Well, it still plays out. There's a little more understanding of the science and appreciation of the gravity of it all for people who are on the one side of the political spectrum. People who are more on the Republican side, it's a mix of what you say. Some people are just, look, it's changing and it's really problematic. I don't want to get into that debate about is it human caused or not. But we got to do something. And then there's also, though, increasingly people, Republicans, in fact, at the Senate, the state Senate, and in the U.S. Senate, but just let's focus on Florida for the moment, where, by the way, it's now the third most populous state in the country, and there are 3 super strong candidates for president living in Florida. So this is, you know, what's happening there is important. It's, you know, they're just, yeah, they say climate's changing, humanity is causing it, and let's do something about it.
Well, that's something that's interesting because we don't get that in the news, which is sort of like, I think the question is, you know, how do we get that narrative out so that people aren't mad at people all the time? You know, I feel like we think that there's a whole 50% of, I'm going off of this, sorry. I know, I feel like there's like 50% of people that our 50% of the people don't know what they're talking about and are denying everything. But it kind of sounds like there's an acceptance about it, but it's not being allowed to be in the political discourse for some reason. And that's what I'm not sure of, because climate isn't political. And truthfully, 20, 30 years ago, it was not political. And then it was political.
Right. Well, I have a website, a new website. I'm very proud of it. The center I direct at FAU, called Center for Environmental Studies, on Monday, we just finally signed the papers to take over this website. And it's tremendous. It's called theinvadingsea.com. Full credit needs to go to Rosemary and Tom O'Hara, who are some local journalists and influencers who started this maybe 5 years ago. And their idea was, as journalists, and I don't know, there are journalists here. Apparently, the news industry is shedding jobs with each passing year, and so the first jobs to go in a newsroom, I think, are on the environment side. And so these, the leading newspapers, Miami Herald, Sun Sentinel, Palm Beach Post, and the local NPR station, WLRN, got together and said, listen, the climate issue is too important to not report on, and it affects all of us. We're neighbors. You know, water goes downhill, and it doesn't, you know, respect political or socioeconomic borders. So let's just put our competitive interests aside, which is kind of radical because newspapers are businesses after all. And they said this is too important. It's a community. We need a community resource that's freely accessible. So they created this website. And on the website, you have news and opinion. And so that's one way to get the message out. And now that it's with us at a university, especially a state university, where I feel we have an obligation to kind of add to the common good because the taxpayers are supporting us, is we're going to add an education domain. So that's hopefully, anybody can visit the website, anybody can contribute to the website content, and so hopefully you all will visit that and let us know what you think.
So basically, you're trying to role model real news.
Real news, yeah,
Real
as opposed
news,
to fake news,
as
yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
which I think is, again, coming out of Florida is really revolutionary at this point and so important. On that vein, like, what do you think that progressives and liberals can do to become more inclusive and try to actually have a real conversation that affects change with people who might not agree with them?
Right. So I made a bold statement that the partisan divide on climate in Florida is over, and I can back that up with some data. I have a couple slides to show later from our statewide public opinion poll at the center. But that's a message I want you to take away with. But it doesn't mean that there aren't still some people who are, well, it's not real, or climate's always changed, so we don't have. How could it possibly be us, and what can we do anyway, and it's too costly, all that. Those questions are actually, they're grounded in legitimate concerns. And so that's one thing to never forget, in my opinion, to answer your question. Another thing is the cardinal error that academics have made, and not only academics, since 1988 when the climate change issue became really national, is to say, oh, well, effectively, implicitly, those morons, which is getting off to a bad start in any conversation. If somebody's getting a signal from you that you kind of are looking down on them, if they're not on board, then they don't understand the science. So all we really need to do is give them more science and more facts. So educate them. That's just not worked. And in this particular case, it's not worked because of what I alluded to a second ago, which is the implicit condescension. And so I may be saying some things that are uncomfortable here, but it's stuff I've lived through in my journey. I came out of the training in this kind of, posture, and I realized it's counterproductive. So there's a law professor at Yale, actually, who got into climate change, social science research, which is my field. Brilliant guy named Dan Kahan, and he introduced me to a simple explanation for why the partisan divide has remained so rigid, and the distance has remained so vast. And the answer is, it's not about science, it's not about education, it's about trust and cultural identity. So the answer to your question is, don't add more facts and science before you can address questions of trust and cultural identity.
I mean, I agree with that so much, and I also always circle back to family and health with everything that I do. And I think I think that the best way to talk to somebody who's not agreeing is, you want your kids to be safe. At the end of the day, you just want your family to be safe. And so if something is going on and you're arguing about it, but it doesn't really, but then, you ask that question, I think it's disarming, because then we're all agreeing with that. There's not one Republican that's going to say, I don't give a shit about my kids. And they're just not going to do that. And so it's the understanding. Do you believe that there are bipartisan environmentalists? And how can they better represent themselves to help their communities? I actually think that your work is bipartisan. You are a bipartisan environmentalist in terms of an occupation. How do you think that could be shared in pop culture, in communities, in schools, in being able to have that point of view? We're really, like we've been saying forever, this is not political. How does that really implement itself? How do you really get that to happen?
It's a great question, and there's probably a handful of answers, but I would circle back to my interpretation of what you said just a second ago, which is one way to engage with people where there's an a priori kind of defensiveness or distance is to identify common values. So, maybe there's evangelical Christians, and that population is coming more and more into the climate field, as it were, because there's this notion of protecting, God's gift to us, or as you were saying, our children and their health, and so shared values is one thing. And by the way, interesting, the Bipartisan Environmentalist. I just want to recognize that in order to work with across the aisle, you need not, in my opinion, abandon your views or your position. And if you may be kind of this, far on a certain issue, away from center, you don't have to abandon that. For me, what bipartisan in this sense means, and it takes us back to the Florida Senate, is having a space for compromise. That's the proof in the pudding.
I fully agree. And, again, then that's all about conversation. It's listening. It's really accepting people. I would love, does anybody have any questions for Colin? Oh,
I'm going to tee up a question.
Oh, apparently, yeah.
Hi, Colin. I know because I've seen some of the figures that you have prepared some slides to show that this is not just a lofty dream of hope, that you have in your head, that there are actually real life breathing Republicans who actually care about the environment. I'd love to give you a chance to show a few of those slides right now.
Well, next slide, please. All right, so this is our new logo. I got a great staff, and this was created in a day with the Florida Climate Resilience Survey. We're putting this survey into the field this week for the 9th time. We run it twice a year. I have to fundraise for it because the university doesn't give it. But this slide I showed to the Senate, and I said, by the way, you probably don't know either, kind of statewide estimate of political views on climate. There hasn't been such a survey. So you have tailwinds, which is to say they're not likely to lose their seats being pro-climate. So next slide, please. Here, Asher is kind of, do you believe in climate change? People can answer from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And as a population, 92%. When do you ever see a number like that?
That's in Florida?
It's only Florida, but it's representative of the state. It's a large sample. And so the party breakdown is, as you see there, the Republicans are in red. NPAs are a big deal, politically swing voters in Florida, which is why it's kind of a purple state, and Democrats. And so you'd kind of expect the ordering breakout by party to be as it is, but even at 84%, the lowest score, if you're an elected official, cynically, I think their job once they get there is to keep their job, right?
Fully agree.
And by the way, and I have tremendous respect for electeds because they handle a lot of stuff. Anyway, 84%, no sweat. This is like unanimity. Now, to be fair, this question is, do you believe in climate change? There's another question where we said, do you believe it's human caused? And so there, of course, the numbers are lower, but it's still 57% for Republicans. And so again, in these days with electoral affairs, on any issue, 57% is kind of a landslide. And so that's one reason, evidence for why you see, and why I went to Tallahassee, which, by the way, by going to Tallahassee, I learned how to spell it. That was something that I just failed. I didn't grow up in Florida. But is to congratulate them because they deserve it. The Senate and the House with the governor, and if you don't know about our governor, you will soon. He has national aspirations, have been very pro-climate in their investment and in their policies in just the last several years. And I can't say that they haven't. I can't not congratulate them.
So I think people have the perception that they campaign in a different way because they're sort of speaking to the other side. I think that, again, that's like real news versus fake news.
Well, you're totally right. In the last 10 years, there's been a progression. But now, as in the last cycle or so of elections, the Republicans who are candidates are saying, climate change is here, and humans are causing it, and I'm going to fight it. And I'm going to fight it better than those socialists. That's what I'm going to do. So that's the... that's actually really interesting new news. So...
Are there any more that you wanted to share?
Yeah, so we could look quickly at the next slide. There's maybe just 17, I think, left. So here, just very quickly, but we took the party breakdown and by age for the three parties, right? NPA is not really a party, but it's an important group. And the question here is, do you agree or disagree, strongly agree, whatever, that climate change is a concern for future generations? And the older Republicans, so above 50, and I asked my staff to just write older, and they chose 50, and that kind of pissed me off. But they tend to be scoring the lowest on these types of things, which is not a surprise. Yeah. But even the older Republicans on this question and others are in the 50% range. Next slide. Here's a simple question, you know, how strongly would you support a tax, say $10 per month to strengthen the state's infrastructure for climate? 42% overall. Is that a majority? No, but that's not a small number. And the final slide, please. Here, this is one that is very actual, very current, and in an important way. And the question is, how strongly do you support or not teaching climate change causes, impacts, and responses in schools, the K through 12 system? And again, it's old and young and the three parties. Even the Republicans over 50 are at 51%. Overall, as a state, 71%. This is tremendous and interesting because of how aggressively the governor in particular has, in the last couple months, really started inserting himself into the K through 12 curriculum, mostly on critical race theory and LGBT, and it's things that, you know, personally I disagree with strongly, but it's notable that they're not saying, you know, when we got to get that socialist climate change stuff out of the K through 12, and that's in part because of public opinion, I think.
You know, this is really interesting, and thank you so much, because I think that there's a little glimmer of climate hope here, because we're talking about Florida and we're talking about a state that I think the perception may not be the reality, and I think that that's a lot of the problems that we have as a country, but you just keep telling them the truth. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share a voice from Florida.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.